The alarm screamed through every corridor of Yathara's cradle, like a wounded animal that refused to die. And 300,000 beings of 40 different species looked up from whatever they were doing and felt the cold hand of fear wrap around their hearts. Station Overseer Kethvani stood in the command center with his crystalline bones humming at a frequency that meant barely controlled panic. And his 4 compound eyes scanned the holographic damage report floating in front of him like a death sentence written in light. The atmospheric cycling array in Sector 9 had cracked. Not a small crack, not a repairable crack, but a deep and ugly fracture that ran through the primary filtration membrane like a river cutting through stone. "How long until we lose breathable air in the affected sectors?" he asked, and his voice was the sound of glass scraping against glass. 6 hours, his second officer replied, "and the replacement component requires viridian alloy. That is currently on a freighter 6 weeks away." Kethvani closed all 4 of his eyes and made the only decision his training allowed him to make. He ordered the evacuation of Sector 9 and the 3 adjoining sectors, displacing 40,000 residents and shutting down the largest trade corridor on the station. He had been the overseer of Yathara's cradle for 30 years, and he had never lost a sector before. But the engineering manuals were clear, and the protocols were absolute. When a system failed and the correct part was unavailable, you sealed the area and waited for the correct part. That was how civilized species handled infrastructure failure. 12 decks below the command center, in a maintenance crawl space that smelled like recycled air and old grease, a human woman named Raya Vasquez heard the alarm and pulled herself out from under a pipe she had been inspecting. She was not supposed to be anywhere near Sector 9. She had been assigned to check low-priority plumbing connections in the residential quarter as part of a cultural exchange program that most of the station's senior staff considered a polite form of babysitting. Humans had only been part of the Galactic Compact for 42 years, and the general opinion among the elder species was that they were enthusiastic but primitive, like giving a child a wrench and letting them watch the adults work. Rhea wiped her hands on her jumpsuit and tapped her communicator. "What broke?" she asked. The answer came back in clipped, irritated tones from a Cerulean technician who clearly had better things to do than talk to the human. "Atmospheric cycling array, Sector 9, primary filtration membrane, viridian alloy housing, catastrophic fracture, no replacement available, evacuation in progress, please stay in your assigned area." Rhea did not stay in her assigned area. She moved through the maintenance tunnels with the ease of someone who had memorized every shortcut on the wall. Station within her first week, and she arrived at the Sector 9 atmospheric processing chamber before the evacuation teams had even finished setting up their barriers. The chamber was enormous, a cathedral of pipes and filters and humming machinery that cleaned and recycled the air for a quarter of the station. And right in the center of it was the crack, a jagged line running through a housing unit the size of a small shuttle, leaking atmosphere with a thin whistle that sounded like the station was slowly exhaling its last breath. Raya stared at it for a long time. She walked around it. She got down on her knees and looked at it from below. She tapped it with her knuckle and listened to the sound it made. Then she opened her toolkit and started pulling things out. She did not have viridian alloy. She did not have a replacement filtration membrane. She did not have any of the 17 specialized tools that the Cerulean engineering manual said were required for this type of task. Repair. What she had was a plasma cutter, a roll of nano-adhesive tape, a length of scrap conduit she had pulled from a decommissioned waste system 3 days ago because it looked useful, and a heating coil she had removed from a broken food printer in the cafeteria because she had wanted to study how it distributed thermal energy. For 4 hours she worked in that crawl space, and what she built was something that no Cerulean engineer would have recognized as a repair. It was ugly and asymmetric, and it used materials that were never designed to touch each other. She rerouted the airflow through the scrap conduit, sealed the crack with 7 layers of nano-adhesive tape, applied in a pattern she calculated in her head, and used the food printer heating coil to regulate the temperature differential that was causing the crack to widen. She created a bypass that sent the air through a path it was never meant to travel, filtered through materials that were never rated for atmospheric processing, held together by adhesive that was technically designed for hole patches on cargo shuttles. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and listened. The whistle was gone. The air was flowing. The system was stable. She tapped her communicator. Vasquez to command. The atmospheric array in Sector 9 is operational. You can cancel the evacuation. There was a very long silence. Kethvani arrived in the maintenance chamber 14 minutes later with an armed security escort and a team of 6 senior Cerulean engineers. He stood in front of Raya's repair, and his crystalline bones went completely still, which was the Cerulean equivalent of someone's jaw dropping so hard it nearly detached from their skull. "This violates 11 station engineering codes," he said. "Yes," Raya agreed. "The materials are incompatible according to every standard in the compact database." "Yes, preparation device. It distributes heat evenly. That is literally what it was designed to do, just not for this." Kethvani turned all 4 of his eyes on her. And in that moment, Torek, the Golvari trade liaison who had followed the commotion out of pure curiosity, saw something he would never forget. He saw one of the most respected engineers in the compact look at a human the way a master painter might look at a child who had just finger-painted a masterpiece on a bathroom wall. Horror and admiration, and a deep, unsettling confusion, all fighting for control of the same face. "It works," Kethvani said, and the way he said it made it sound like an accusation. "It works," Raya confirmed, and the way she said it made it sound like that was the only thing that had ever mattered. Torek went back to his quarters that night and opened his personal journal. He sat for a long time trying to find the right words, and finally he wrote a single entry that he would never forget. Look back on years later, as the moment everything changed. The humans do not build things the way we do. They do not follow the blueprints or respect the specifications or use the correct materials. They look at a problem that our best minds say requires 6 weeks and 10 million credits to solve, and they solve it in 4 hours with garbage and tape. And the worst part, the part that keeps me awake, is that it works. It should not work, but it works, and I'm beginning to think that the humans know something about the universe that the rest of us have been too proud to learn. He closed the journal and stared at the ceiling, and somewhere deep in the station, air flowed through a food printer coil and kept 300,000 people breathing. The Hall of Engineering Standards on Maharis Prime was one of the oldest buildings in the Galactic Compact, and it had been designed to make anyone who entered it feel very small and very aware that the rules of the universe were not suggestions. The ceiling rose so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top, and the walls were lined with the engineering achievements of 100 species. Perfect structures, flawless machines, devices that operated exactly as designed, for thousands of years without a single deviation from their original specifications. It was into this temple of precision that Dr. Liang Maro walked on a Tuesday morning, wearing a rumpled jacket and carrying a coffee stain on his sleeve that he had not noticed and would not have cared about if he had. He was there to explain why humans kept breaking things in ways that somehow made them work better, and he was fairly certain that nobody in the room was going to enjoy hearing the answer. Quolas sat at the center of the Tribunal platform, his serpentine body coiled around the ancient stone seat that had been carved for his species 10,000 years ago. He was Denori, a methane-breathing elder species that had been practicing engineering since before most of the compact races had developed written language. His scales were the color of tarnished silver, and his eyes were the color of a dying star. And when he spoke, the translation matrix carried his words with the weight of someone who had seen civilizations rise and fall, and considered most of them disappointing. "This tribunal has been convened," Quolis began, not to judge any individual human, but to assess a pattern of behavior that has been reported with increasing frequency across compact space. We have designated this pattern as Case File 7741H, and the evidence is extensive. He gestured with one long, articulated limb, and the holographic display activated. Appeared. A human cargo pilot named Santiago Ruiz had suffered a catastrophic failure of his ship's faster-than-light drive while transporting medical supplies to a plague-stricken colony. The FTL core had fractured, and without it, the ship was stranded 3 months from the nearest port. 3 months the colony did not have. Santiago had looked at his broken FTL drive, then looked at his cargo straps, then looked at his ship's entertainment system, and then he had done something that the Compact's finest physicists later described as theoretically impossible but empirically undeniable. He had created a feedback loop using the entertainment system signal processor to regulate the energy output of the fractured core, held the whole thing together with cargo straps rated for securing crates not containing fundamental forces of physics, and jumped to FTL for just long enough to reach the colony. The medical supplies arrived 11 days ahead of the deadline. The ship's entertainment system never worked again, but Santiago said he had already seen all the movies anyway. The second case appeared. A human colony on the world of Dreshen 7 had been established on a planet whose geology turned out to be radically different from what the survey had predicted. The geothermal power grid they had brought was designed for a planet with shallow magma channels, but Dreshen 7's heat sources were deep and unevenly distributed. The correct solution was to order a new power grid designed for the actual geology, a process that would take 2 years. The colonists did not wait 2 years. They took their mining equipment, drills and borers and excavation machines that were designed to extract ore, not energy, and they rebuilt them. They turned rock-eating machines into heat-catching machines, and within 6 months they had a functioning power grid that was ugly and loud and shook the ground every few hours, but kept the lights on and the heaters running through a winter that would have killed them all. The third case appeared, and this one made several delegates lean forward in their seats. A 9-year-old human girl on Frontier Station Kappa had noticed that the water recycler in her family's habitat module was broken. Her parents had filed a maintenance request that was sitting in a queue behind 400 other requests. The girl had taken apart one of her toys, a mechanical bird that flapped its wings when you wound it up, and she had used its spring mechanism and a rubber band from her hair to create a manual pump that moved water through the filter at just enough pressure to keep the recycler functioning until the repair crew arrived. She had not read any engineering manuals. She had not consulted any databases. She had simply looked at a problem and built a solution out of whatever was within arm's reach. Quolis let the silence hold after the last case faded from the display. Then he turned his ancient eyes toward Dr. Morrow. "Xenostructural theorist," he said. "You study how different species approach the act of building. Explain your species to us, Dr. Morrow. Explain why these incidents keep happening." Leon Morrow stood and adjusted his rumpled jacket and took a breath. "Every species in this room," he began, "learned to engineer in an environment of relative stability. Your worlds were kinder than ours, or you had more time, or your resources were more abundant. You developed engineering as a discipline of perfection. You identify the correct solution, you gather the correct materials, you execute the correct procedure, and you produce the correct result. This is beautiful and admirable, and it has built wonders that my species can only dream of." He paused and looked around the hall at the monuments to precision that lined the walls. Earth was not kind to us. Our world tried to kill us every single day for 200,000 years. We had ice ages that buried our homes, earthquakes that swallowed our cities, plagues that killed half our population, and wars that destroyed everything we had built, sometimes more than once. We did not have the luxury of waiting for the correct solution, because the correct solution was often years away, and we were dying now. He brought up a holographic display of his own, images from human history, bridges built from fallen trees during floods, cities rebuilt from their own rubble after bombings, ships repaired at sea with nothing but what was on board. We developed a different relationship with engineering. We do not see it as the application of known solutions. We see it as the invention of new solutions under pressure. We have a concept that I am told has no direct translation in any of the 14 major compact languages. It is called good enough. The translation matrix stuttered. The word came through in Cyrillian as something close to acceptable failure. In Golvari, it registered as functional inadequacy. It simply did not translate at all. And Quolus's translator emitted a soft tone that indicated conceptual incompatibility. Good enough does not mean we accept poor quality, Morrow continued. It means we recognize that a solution that works now is more valuable than a perfect solution that arrives too late. It means we would rather build something ugly that saves lives today than something beautiful that saves lives next year. A Meherite delegate raised a limb. But the structural risks, the failure probabilities, your improvised solutions have failure rates that are orders of magnitude higher than standard compact engineering. Yes, Morrow agreed. And their success rates in emergency situations are orders of magnitude higher too, because they exist. When the standard solution is unavailable, a 90% solution built from scrap metal and stubbornness will save more lives than a 100% solution that is sitting in a warehouse 6-star systems away. Quolus leaned forward, and the ancient stone creaked beneath his coils. Let me ask you a direct question, Dr. Morrow. Do humans ever follow a blueprint exactly as it is written? Morrow paused, and a small smile crossed his face, the kind of smile that made several delegates unconsciously lean back in their seats. Only when we cannot think of something better, he said. The hall was quiet for a very long time. The tribunal voted that afternoon. They classified human engineering practices as anomalous but non-sanctionable, which was the compact's way of saying, we cannot punish this because it keeps working, and we hate that. The vote was unanimous, though several delegates asked for the record to show that their agreement was reluctant. That evening, in his private chambers, Arbiter Quolus opened a secure channel and authorized the creation of a classified intelligence file. The file was to be maintained by the Compact's Strategic Assessment Division. Updated whenever a new incident was reported. It was given a simple and quiet designation: Structural Unpredictability Risk, Human Origin. He stared at the file for a long time before closing it, and somewhere in the back of his 10,000-year-old mind, a thought formed that he did not enjoy having. It was the thought that the universe might not belong to the species that built the most perfect machines, but to the species that refused to stop building when the machines broke. The ambush came at the worst possible moment, which was exactly when the Vrethkai had planned for it to come. The compact patrol fleet was passing through the Narrows, a thin corridor of space between two nebulae that served as the only navigable route along the border. When 36 Vrethkai warships dropped out of FTL in a perfect crescent formation and opened fire before the compact ships had even finished recalibrating their sensors. Fleet Commander Salur, a Galvari admiral who had spent 40 years preparing for exactly this kind of engagement, watched 3 of his cruisers take crippling hits in the first 12 seconds and felt his 6 limbs go cold. The Vrethkai were not like the other threats the Compact had faced. They were an empire built on conquest, a species that had evolved as pack hunters on a world where everything was predator and nothing was prey. Their ships were fast and vicious and designed for one purpose: to destroy things quickly and move on to the next thing. They did not negotiate. They did not posture. They simply arrived and killed and took what was left. All ships, emergency formation Delta, Salur ordered, his voice steady despite the ice in his veins. Fall back to the nebula boundary and prepare for defensive engagement. Every ship in the fleet acknowledged and began to retreat. Every ship except one. The human frigate Indomitable had taken 2 direct hits in the opening salvo. One had destroyed the main weapons array, turning the ship's primary offensive capability into a smoking ruin of melted metal and dead circuits. The second had punched through the shield generator, leaving the ship naked and vulnerable in the middle of a killing field. By every standard of compact military doctrine, the Indomitable was combat ineffective and should have been the first ship to retreat. Captain Dara Okonkwo stood on her bridge and watched the damage reports scroll across her screen, and felt something that the made away Vrethkai had never encountered in all their centuries of conquest. She felt annoyed. "Amos," she said into the ship-wide channel, and her voice was calm in the way that a river is calm right before it goes over a waterfall. "What have we got?" Senior Technician Amos Ferreira was already waist-deep in the guts of the ship's systems. His hand-tooled wrench, the one he called diplomacy, clenched between his teeth. He pulled it out and spoke while sparks rained down around him. "Main weapons are gone. Shields are gone. Hull integrity is at 60% and dropping. Life support is stable, but I give it an hour before the secondary power coupling burns out." He paused and looked at the chaos around him, and a grin spread across his face. The kind of grin that his crewmates had learned to both love and fear. "But we still have the mining laser, the deflector array, the tractor beam, the coolant system, and about 40 tons of reactor waste in Cargo Bay 7 that we were supposed to dump at the next station." "Can you give me weapons?" Okonkwo asked. "Captain, I can give you something much worse than weapons. I can give you surprises." What happened over the next 47 minutes would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for generations, and every species that studied it would come away with the same conclusion: that humans did not fight the way any sane species fought, and that this was precisely what made them so dangerous. The first surprise came 6 minutes into the engagement. Amos and his team rerouted the mining laser, a utility tool designed to cut asteroids for mineral extraction, through the deflector array. The deflector was designed to redirect energy away from the ship, but Amos reversed its polarity and turned it into a focusing lens. The result was a weapon that no military engineer had ever conceived of, because no military engineer would have looked at a rock-cutting tool and a defensive shield, seen them as 2 halves of the same thing. The improvised beam punched through the forward armor of a Vrethkai destroyer, with a shot that the enemy ship's tactical computer did not even register as a weapon's discharge, because technically it was not one. The second surprise came 12 minutes later. The Indomitable was taking heavy fire from 3 ships, and the hull temperature was climbing toward critical levels. The standard response was to activate cooling systems and try to maintain structural integrity. Amos activated the cooling systems, but instead of cycling the coolant through the ship's internal network, he vented it directly into space in a precisely calculated pattern. The coolant was a specialized compound that crystallized at vacuum temperatures and created a cloud of reflective particles that scrambled the Vrethkai's targeting sensors. For 90 seconds, the enemy ships were firing blind, and in those 90 seconds, the Indomitable repositioned and fired its improvised weapon 3 more times. The third surprise was the one that broke the Vrethkai's will to fight. Cargo Bay 7 contained 40 tons of unstable reactor waste, the byproduct of the ship's fusion core, mildly radioactive and extremely volatile when compressed. It was stored in a reinforced cargo pod designed to contain it safely during transport. Amos had his team detach the cargo pod, seal it, and move it into the tractor beam's targeting range. "Captain," he said, "I need you to aim us at the big one, the command ship." "Amos, what am I looking at here?" "You are looking at the galaxy's ugliest torpedo." Okonkwo understood immediately. She turned the battered, burning, barely holding together Indomitable toward the Vrethkai command ship and accelerated. The enemy saw a crippled frigate charging straight at them and assumed it was a desperate ramming attempt, a suicide move. They did not adjust their formation because a single frigate crashing into their flagship would barely scratch it. At the last moment, the Indomitable fired the tractor beam in reverse, not pulling the cargo pod toward them, but launching it away from them like a stone from a slingshot. The pod streaked across the gap between the ships at a velocity the Vrethkai's computers registered as debris, because no weapon in their database matched its profile. When it struck the command ship's lower hull, and the 40 tons of reactor waste compressed on impact and detonated, the explosion tore through 4 decks and disabled the ship's engine core. The Indomitable banked hard, its hull groaning and cracking, pieces of its outer armor peeling away like dead skin. Fire burned in 3 compartments, and the life support system was running on backup power. And Amos was literally holding a critical junction together with his hands, while a crewmate welded it shut around his fingers. But the ship was still flying, and the Vrethkai were no longer fighting. 4 of their warships were destroyed or disabled. Their command ship was dark and drifting. The remaining fleet looked at the burning human frigate that had done all of this, a ship that by every measure should have been dead 30 minutes ago. And they made a decision that no Vrethkai fleet had made in recorded history. They retreated. Fleet Commander Salur sat in his command chair and watched the enemy ships disappear into FTL, and he could not speak for a very long time. His tactical officer was replaying the battle footage with an expression of someone trying to understand a magic trick, and his communications officer was receiving frantic requests from every other ship in the fleet asking what had just happened. Salur finally found his voice. He opened his official log and began to dictate his report, and when he reached the section about the Indomitable, he paused and chose his words with the care of someone who knew that what he said would be read by admirals and politicians and historians. Recommend that human vessels never be cornered, he said. They do not behave as damaged ships should. They do not follow standard combat deterioration patterns. They do not become less dangerous as they take damage. They become more creative, and creativity in combat is a force multiplier that our tactical models are not equipped to predict. Damage to a human vessel is not a step toward its defeat. It is merely an invitation for its crew to innovate. And their innovations are more frightening than any weapon I have encountered in 40 years of service. The report was transmitted to Compact Command and classified at the highest level. But as these things always do, it leaked. The Vrethkai intercepted a copy 6 days later. Their military intelligence division read it 3 times and then created a new file in their strategic database. The file contained every piece of information they could gather about human engineering, capabilities, human improvisation patterns, and human behavior under extreme stress. It was given a classification level reserved for extinction-level threats. The title of the file was 4 words long, and those 4 words would echo through the halls of Vrethkai Military Command for decades to come. Do not engage human engineers. Somewhere in a repair dock, Amos Ferreira sat on the floor of what was left of the Indomitable's engine room and patted the scorched metal wall with a bandaged hand. His wrench, diplomacy, was bent but unbroken, much like the ship itself. "Good girl," he said quietly, "we will get you patched up." And everyone who heard him knew that he meant it, and that the repairs would involve things that no engineering manual had ever described, and that they would work anyway, because that is what humans did. The ground split open on a Wednesday, and by Thursday the colony of Veraf 4 was dying. It was not a dramatic death, not fire or flood or enemy attack, but the slow and terrible death of a community being torn in half. The tectonic rift had appeared without warning, a crack in the continent that widened by 3 meters every day, and it ran directly through the middle of the colony's only land bridge between the eastern settlements and the western settlements. The east had the farms and the water treatment plants. The west had the hospital and the power station and the spaceport. Without a connection between them, both sides would starve, or freeze, or simply wither away like two halves of a body separated from each other. The Compact Disaster Engineering Corps sent their assessment within 48 hours. A megastructure bridge could be built across the rift using standard construction protocols fabricated from certified materials designed to withstand the ongoing tectonic activity with a safety margin of 400%. It would take 18 months to complete. The colony had 3 weeks before the rift became too wide to cross by any temporary means. And after that, the two halves would be permanently isolated through the coming winter. A winter that lasted 9 months on Vareth 4, and killed anything that was not sheltered and heated and fed. Maren Solveig read the assessment report on her datapad, and then set the datapad down on her desk, and stared at the wall of her office for exactly 30 seconds. She was the colony's infrastructure lead, a human civil engineer who had spent 12 years on Earth working with the Pacific Rim Reconstruction Corps, the agency that rebuilt cities after earthquakes and tsunamis, and the kinds of disasters that did not wait for permits and procurement orders. She had seen impossible deadlines before. She had never enjoyed them, but she had never failed to meet one either. Meeting. The colony's engineering staff gathered in the main hall. Humans and Ceruleans and Golvari, and a single Maharite who had been assigned to the colony as an architectural consultant. His name was Dream, and he was considered one of the greatest structural minds in the Galactic Compact. He had designed buildings that would stand for 10,000 years. He had built bridges across chasms on 12 different worlds. His work was in the textbooks of every engineering academy in the Compact, and he had never met a problem he could not solve with enough time and the right materials. He had also never worked with a human engineer before, and he was about to learn why the rest of the galaxy had started keeping files on them. "Here is what I propose," Maren said, and she brought up a holographic model of the colony. "We cannot fabricate bridge materials in 3 weeks. We do not have the raw resources, and we do not have the manufacturing capacity." She highlighted structures on the map: the secondary storage warehouses, the decommissioned transit rail that had been shut down after the rift made its route impassable, the agricultural mech suits that the farmers used for heavy planting and harvesting, the reinforced walls of 3 buildings that were no longer in use since their residents had been evacuated to the east side. "We take the colony apart," she said. "We use what we have. We turn the transit rail into load-bearing spans. We use the warehouse support beams as the primary structure. We strip the reinforced walls for foundation anchoring. And we use the mech suits as construction exoskeletons because we do not have cranes." The silence in the room was the kind of silence that happens when a large number of intelligent beings all have the same thought at the same time. And the thought is, she cannot be serious. Dreen was the first to speak, and his voice carried the careful patience of someone who was serious and tackling thoughts without hope or harm.com, trying to explain gravity to a creature that had never experienced it. "Engineer Solveig, I must object in the strongest terms. The materials you are describing were designed for specific purposes, with specific load tolerances and specific stress ratings. A transit rail is engineered to support the lateral forces of a moving vehicle, not the vertical compression of a bridge span. A warehouse beam is rated for static loads in a controlled environment, not dynamic wind and seismic forces over a 300-meter chasm. This is not engineering. This is—" he searched for a word and could not find one in his own language. "This is madness." "I understand," Maren said, and there was no anger in her voice, only the calm certainty of someone who had built things out of wrong materials before and knew what she was about to say next. "I understand that every material I have listed was designed for a different purpose. With that, I am arguing that purpose is not destiny. A thing can be more than what it was made to be if you understand the forces acting on it, well enough to compensate. She pulled up images on the display. Not engineering diagrams, but photographs from Earth's history. A bridge in a country called Vietnam, built by villagers out of the roots of living trees, spanning a river gorge that modern engineers said should have required steel and concrete. A cathedral in a country called Spain, designed by a man named Gaudi, who had understood that curves carried weight better than straight lines, and had built towers that looked like they should fall, but never did. A wartime bridge in a country called Burma, built by prisoners with hand tools and salvaged materials, that carried trains across a valley for decades. Humans have been building impossible things out of wrong materials for our entire history, she said, not because we wanted to, but because we had to. Never available when we needed them most. So we learned to see what things could become instead of what they were designed to be. Dreen stared at the photographs for a long time. His species processed visual information differently than humans. They saw structural forces the way humans saw color, instinctively and immediately. And what he saw in those images disturbed him, because the forces should not have balanced, but they did. Even if I accepted your premise, he said slowly, the calculations required to compensate for using materials outside their design parameters would be extraordinarily complex. The margin for error would be almost non-existent. Marin looked at him and smiled. That is why I need you. The partnership that formed over the next 21 days was unlike anything the colony had ever seen. Marin brought the vision, the ability to look at a warehouse beam and see a bridge support, to look at a transit rail and see a spanning truss, mech suit and see a crane. Dreen brought the precision, the ability to calculate exactly how much stress each repurposed component could bear, where the weak points would emerge, how to distribute the load so that the wrong materials could carry it safely. They argued constantly. Dreen would look at a section of the design and declare it structurally unsound, and Marin would redesign it on the spot using a different combination of salvaged materials. And Dreen would run the calculations and find that it was somehow within tolerance. They developed a rhythm. She would propose something impossible, and he would find a way to make it merely improbable, and together they would push it across the line into reality. The colony threw itself into the work. Every resident who could lift a tool became a construction worker. The mech suits were fitted with welding attachments and lifting arms, and they marched out to the edge of the chasm, like mechanical giants, ready to wrestle the earth itself. The transit rail was cut and shaped and welded into spanning trusses that Dreen had calculated down to the millimeter. The warehouse beams were reinforced with strips of hull plating from a grounded shuttle that would never fly again, and they became the spine of a bridge that grew out from both sides of the rift, like two hands reaching for each other. On the 19th day, the two halves of the bridge met in the middle over the darkness of the chasm, and the final connection was welded into place by Marin herself, while Dreen stood below and monitored the stress readings with an intensity that made his centroid body tremble. The bridge held. It was not beautiful by any standard that the compact recognized. One section was visibly made from a repurposed greenhouse, the transparent panels replaced with metal sheeting, but the frame still curved in the organic shape of its original purpose. The support pillars were different heights because they had come from different buildings. The surface was uneven because the transit rail sections had been designed for a different gauge than the bridge required. But it held. 300 meters across a growing chasm, bearing the weight of vehicles and pedestrians and the entire future of the colony, built in 3 weeks from materials that were never meant to be a bridge. Dreen stood at the eastern end and looked at what they had built. He stood there for a very long time, and his silicon-based body processed the structural forces flowing through the bridge. Forces that his calculations said should be there, but that his instincts said should not. And something changed in him. Something that had been rigid and certain for his entire career, bent just enough to let a new idea in. "It should not stand," he said quietly, and his voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with structural engineering, but it does, and it is beautiful in a way that I do not have the mathematics to. Narration stood beside him, exhausted and covered in welding burns, and grinning the way humans grinned when they had done something that everyone said could not be done. "We are calling it the Axiom Bridge," she said. "Why?" "Because it broke every axiom in the book, and it is still standing." Dreen looked at her, and then looked at the bridge, and then looked back at her, and for the first time in his centuries-long career, the greatest structural mind in the Galactic Compact laughed. It was not a laugh of mockery or disbelief. It was the laugh of someone who had just discovered that the universe was bigger than his equations, and that the discovery was not terrifying, but wonderful. The Axiom Bridge stood for 90 years before it was finally replaced by a proper megastructure, and when the demolition crews came to take it down, they found that the improvised structure had actually grown stronger over time, into each other under the constant stress, and formed bonds that no one had predicted. They left one section standing as a monument, and the plaque at its base read simply, "Built in 3 weeks from what was available, by those who refused to wait for what was not." 10 years had passed since the night Raya Vasquez fixed an atmospheric cycling array with a food printer coil, and changed the way the galaxy thought about duct tape. And now she stood backstage at the Centennial Engineering Summit on Maharis Prime, and tried to remember how to breathe. The auditorium was the largest enclosed space she had ever seen, a vast dome of living crystal that the Maharites had grown over the course of 1,000 years, and it held representatives from every species in the Galactic Compact. 12,000 delegates filled the curved seats that rose in tiers toward the distant ceiling, and billions more watched through broadcast relays that carried the signal to every inhabited world in known space. Raya was 53 years old now, and the years had changed her in the way that years change people who spend them doing hard things in difficult places. There were lines on her face that had been put there by worry and wind and welding heat. Hands were scarred from 100 repairs that the engineering manual said were impossible. She had been given a title that had not existed before she made it necessary. Humanity's first consul of engineering, which was the Compact's way of acknowledging that humans needed a representative who could explain them to the rest of the galaxy, before the rest of the galaxy had a collective nervous breakdown. She was here today because the Vrethkai hegemony had proposed a ceasefire. This should have been good news, and it was, except for the single condition attached to it. The Vrethkai wanted human engineers banned from all military applications across the Compact. No human could design, build, modify, or repair any weapon, warship, or military installation. This was the price of peace. The condition had sent shockwaves through the Compact, not because it was unreasonable on its face, but because of what it represented. An empire that had conquered 200 worlds and never retreated from a fight in its entire history was standing before the galaxy and saying openly and without shame that the most dangerous thing in the Compact was not a fleet or a superweapon, but a human being with access to spare parts. Some Compact species wanted to accept the deal. They were tired of the border skirmishes and the constant threat of escalation, and if all it took to end the conflict was limiting where human engineers could work, then perhaps that was a small price to pay. Others saw it for what it was, an enemy admitting fear and trying to use diplomacy to remove the thing it feared most. The debate had raged for weeks, and it had all led to this moment, the keynote address at the most important engineering gathering in the galaxy, delivered for the first time in history by a human. Rhea walked onto the stage, and 12,000 beings fell silent. She looked out at them, the crystalline Ceruleans, the coiled Denori, the six-limbed Golvari, the towering Maharites, and dozens of others whose names and forms she had learned over a decade of working alongside them. She saw faces she recognized. Kethvani sat in the Cerulean delegation, his compound eyes fixed on her, with an expression she had learned to read as grudging respect. Arbiter Quolus occupied his traditional seat in the Elder Species section, ancient and watchful. Torek was there too, the Golvari trade liaison who had written about her in his journal all those years ago, now retired and gray, but still watching humans with the same wary fascination. And in the front row of the guest section, Dreen sat with his centaurioid body perfectly still. And when Raya's eyes found him, he inclined his head in the smallest of nods, the Meteorite gesture that meant, "I am with you." Raya did not give a technical lecture. She did not present data or cite engineering standards or argue policy. She told stories. She told them about the night she fixed the atmospheric array on Yethara's cradle with scrap and tape, and how Kefvani had looked at her repair like it was an offense against the laws of physics, and also the only reason 300,000 people were still breathing. She told them about Santiago Ruiz and his cargo straps, and his broken entertainment system, and the colony that got its medicine 11 days early. She told them about the 9-year-old girl with the rubber band, who fixed a water recycler because she did not know she was not supposed to be able to. She told them about the Indomitable, about Amos Ferreira and his wrench called diplomacy, about mining lasers turned into weapons, and coolant turned into camouflage, and reactor waste turned into the ugliest torpedo in military history. She told them about Fleet Commander Siluer's report, and she watched the Golvari delegates shift uncomfortably because they knew that report was true. She told them about the Axiom Bridge, about Marin Solveig and Dreen and 21. Days of arguing and building and refusing to accept that a greenhouse could not become a bridge. She told them about the plaque that read, "Built from what was available by those who refused to wait for what was not." And then she stopped telling stories and spoke to them directly. "I know why you are afraid of us," she said, and her voice was gentle, but it carried to every corner of the dome. "I know because sometimes we are afraid of ourselves. We look at the things we build, the impossible, improbable, held together with stubbornness things, and we wonder how they work. We wonder if the next time we reach into a pile of scrap and try to pull out a miracle, there will be nothing there." She paused and let the silence hold. "But I need you to understand something about my species. We do not innovate because we are clever, although some of us are. We do not innovate because we are brave, although some of us are that too. We innovate because for 200,000 years, innovation was the only thing standing between us and extinction. Every single thing a human has ever built, from the first stone tool, to the first fire, to the first wheel, to the first ship that carried us between the stars, was built because someone was afraid and cold and desperate, and they looked at what they had, and they asked a question." Her voice dropped, and every translator in the dome worked to carry the weight of what she said next. They asked, "What if we tried it anyway?" She looked at the Vrethkai delegation, 4 armored figures who sat rigid and unreadable in their sealed environment suits. "You want to ban human engineers from war? We understand. You have seen what we do when we are cornered, and it frightens you. It frightens us too. But I want you to know that if you ban us from your battlefields, we will not stop building. We cannot stop building. It is what we are." She straightened, and her voice grew stronger. "Off your warships. We will build hospitals. If you take us out of your weapons labs, we will build schools. If you ban us from every military installation in the compact, we will build bridges across chasms that should not be crossable, and power grids on worlds that should not be livable, and water recyclers out of toys and rubber bands." She looked across the vast dome and spoke the words that would be remembered long after everything else was forgotten. "And one day you will look at what we have built, and you will realize that the thing you should have feared was never our weapons. It was our hope. Because a species that can look at a pile of scrap and see a miracle, that can look at a broken world and see a home, that can look at the impossible and see a Tuesday afternoon, that species will never stop reaching for the stars. And no ban, no treaty, no amount of fear will change that. Because we do not build because we are ordered to. We build because we cannot imagine looking at a problem and walking away. The dome was silent. 12,000 beings from 100 worlds sat in their seats, and the silence stretched and grew until it became something larger than the absence of sound. It became the silence of a galaxy recognizing something it had always known but never been willing to say. That the small, short-lived, fragile species from the unremarkable planet in the unfashionable arm of the galaxy had something that none of them had ever been able to name, and that the name for it was not stubbornness, or recklessness, or insanity. The name for it was hope. Dreen stood first. His silicon body unfolded to its full height, and his forelimbs came together in the Meherite gesture of profound respect that was usually reserved for structures that had stood for millennia. The sound of his limbs meeting echoed in the silent dome like the first crack of thunder before a storm. Then Kethvani stood, his crystalline bones chiming. Torek rose on his 6 legs, and somewhere in the back, Arbiter Qualis uncoiled his ancient body and raised himself higher than he had in decades. The applause began slowly, and then it grew, and it grew, and it grew, until the living crystal of the dome hummed with it. And the sound was carried by broadcast relays to every world in the compact. And on each of those worlds, someone heard it and understood that something had changed. The ceasefire was ratified that evening, and the engineering ban was not included. The Vrethkai negotiator was asked by a journalist why they had conceded the point, and he stood in the corridor outside the summit hall and was quiet for a moment before he answered. Because we realized that banning human engineers would not make them less dangerous. It would simply make us less prepared for what they build next. And I have seen what they build next. None of us are ready for it. But I think perhaps that is the point. Far from Meheris Prime, in a quiet apartment on a quiet station, Torek sat at his desk and opened his memoirs to the final chapter. He was old now, and his 6 limbs ached, and his eyes were not what they had been, but his mind was sharp, and his memory was clear. He had been writing this book for 10 years, trying to capture what it meant to live in a galaxy that contained humans, and now at last he had the words for the ending. He wrote slowly and carefully because he wanted to get it right. I have walked among 100 species. I have seen civilizations that sculpt light, and nations that sing worlds into being. I have watched the Denori contemplate problems for centuries, and the Meherites build structures that will outlast stars. But in all my years and all my travels, I never met a species that looked at the impossible and said, "Hand me that wrench." He paused and smiled the way old men smile when they remember something that still amazes them. The galaxy does not dread human engineers because they are reckless. We dread them because they look at the rules of the universe the way a poet looks at grammar, as a suggestion. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, is that they are usually right. He set down his pen and leaned back, and through the window of his apartment he could see the stars. And somewhere out there, among them, humans were building something new, something improbable and beautiful, and held together with tape and hope and the unshakable belief that nothing was truly impossible if you were stubborn enough to try. And the galaxy watched, and the galaxy wondered, and the galaxy dreaded what they would build next, and the galaxy could not wait to see it.